right. I'm going to kick us off. Thanks everyone for joining us for this next session of the MIT IDE lunch seminar. We're in for a big treat today. We have Renée Gosline, who's a senior research scientist and senior lecturer and a group research lead at the MIT IDE, leading the group on the human AI connection. She also has just won MIT Sloan's most important teaching honor, the Jameson Award. Congratulations to Renée for that. And also, along with her, Patrick Connolly, who's the Global Responsible AI Lead for Accenture Research. They have been doing some really fantastic and interesting work about improving human and Gen AI performance, and they're going to be describing it today. I am very interested to hear, as I know that Renée has had in her wheelhouse this concept of friction being a really important element of how we deal with AI, how we deal with technology in general. Just getting us to slow down and think critically, I think, is a really important piece of the puzzle from her perspective and in general. And I think that this research really drives that home as we consider outputs from Gen AI in our work-related tasks. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We typically have a rule that everyone should be muted, just so as to make sure that we minimize the distractions. We've had a sort of rule of thumb in the past of turning videos off also to avoid distractions. Sometimes people tend to get up and walk around their office or apartment, which may be distracting to the presenters. I'll leave that up to you, depending on whether you feel like you may be engaging in some distracting physical activity or not. If you are going to ask a question, just raise your hand with the raise your hand button for clarifying questions during, and then we'll have some time for Q&A after as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Renée and Patrick.
Thank you, Sinan. Thank you for that kind introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. This lunch seminar conflicts with my research lab meeting, so I don't get to be here as often as I'd like. So I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm also excited to share this time with Patrick, who goes by Patty. Patty and I meet, I think we've met just about every week for the last year or so. And I'm just excited about our collaboration. As a former practitioner myself, I always feel like I have a hybrid brain, and I think about kind of from a research and literature standpoint, but also from a practitioner standpoint. And as Sinan mentioned, this idea of friction being an important element in human AI collaboration is something I've been talking about for a while, but the folks at Accenture, Patty particularly, have been kind enough to allow us to sort of pressure test this. So I'll share with you an experiment that we collaborated on, and that's just coming out in a paper. But here's how we'll spend our time. So I think I'll just give you just a little slight introduction to the group that I lead, and then I'll hand it over to Patty, who will bring the managerial perspective, which I think is so critical because the vast majority of AI development is being done so by private organizations, by private corporations, right? Not by academics, not by schools and universities. So they very much are imprinting and leading us in where we're going, which is why I think his perspective is so vital. But before I hand it over to him, as you know, in the IDE, we have multiple research groups. Hey, Ryan, thank you for listening to that talk, that SMR talk. I appreciate it. And this will be different, so hopefully not redundant. So we have different research groups, and the one that I lead is called the Human First AI group. And the perspective is right there in the name, right? Which is at the IDE, we care about technology and hope that it will have a beneficial impact on society. And the Human AI research group really looks through a behavioral lens, and I'll talk about that more in a bit, to understand how we can maximize the benefit and prevent and minimize harm to humans, but do so by understanding cognitive processing and how human beings make decisions and the circumstances under which AI augments that and the circumstances under which AI could actually amplify or augment bias, cognitive bias. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. I hope you value that too. And before I get into the nitty-gritty then, let me pass it over to Patty to give you the Accenture point of view and how we came to collaborate. Patty, over to you.
Thanks very much, Renee. And I wanted to be the one that dropped the Jameson bomb, but Sinan beat me to the punch. But huge congratulations. And I can honestly say I am working with the best of the best now. There can be no disputes. So look, thanks everybody for attending today. As Renee mentioned, she'll kind of get into the experiment in more detail. I suppose a quick intro on my side. My name is Patrick Connolly, or Paddy. I head up responsible AI research globally for Accenture Research, and Accenture Research is essentially Accenture's think tank. And our job is the application of research to solve our clients' problems. And in this case, we tend to work very closely with our RAI practice, or responsible AI practice, which is led by Arnab Chakrabarty. And so, what some of the areas I want to kind of talk very briefly about is that kind of Accenture perspective on, the topic of human first approach to AI, and specifically GenAI, and also, how we can design for risk mitigation and optimization of performance. And I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between MIT and Accenture through IDE, and also then I'll finish up maybe setting the scene, talking about how do you actually practically run an experiment in a large organization like Accenture. And to Renee's point, it's very well to talk about these things in theory, but there are a lot of issues that need to be resolved in doing that. And hopefully by doing this, we're going to make it easier for clients as they look to also take a more experimental approach. So I think we're here to talk about optimization of human plus Gen AI performance using beneficial friction. These are topics that I start to see kind of creeping into the mainstream over the last 12 months, and for very good reason. But I think the research behind this has been going on for many years, either individually by myself and Renee, or now collaboratively together. And so in both cases, I think it's very much rooted in a responsible AI approach. And for me, I've been working in this space for probably 7 or 8 years now. I very partially helped to build one of the first ever algorithmic fairness tools. And one of the first things I did in this space was I created my own AI incident tracker. And I just looked at all the incidents that have been announced and tried to give myself a better understanding of the space. And I had this column in my Excel that tried to identify the problem or the cause of the harm. And at the time, there was a very strong focus on technological problems, and I kept having to change my Excel and my options for these kind of non-technical issues. And it eventually became very clear to me that actually a lot of the root causes are not technical, but actually are occurring at the human plus AI decision-making stage. And more specifically, it's due to behavioral issues like overtrust and undertrust and overconfidence. And we've seen in response to this, we've seen areas emerge like explainability, which are absolutely essential to any RAI offering today. But what we also see is that in some situations, and for some employees and some users, it's not sufficient to give them the information they need to make the right decisions. And so a lot of my research over the last year, kind of 5 or 6 years, has been looking at this side of it. What are the new tools, the new techniques, the new approaches that we can apply in this context to give employees and users the ability to make better decisions. And actually, one of the first experiments we ran at Accenture Research, and also at the dock where I'm located, which was published in MIT Sloan quite a number of years ago. It was around the same time as our Paul Doherty, our CTIO, was releasing his first book, which is Human and Machine. And we wanted to take the learnings from that report or that book and practically apply them. So we took an existing human plus AI system, and we try to reimagine it in a more symbiotic way. And I'll kind of cut to the chase on this one. There's a reason why I'm telling this story. But what we found is we looked at, multiple different interventions and multiple different strategies. I think there was 9 competing options. And what we actually ended up doing was we realized that, to have the biggest impact, what we needed to do was not kind of create technical solutions or technical understanding. What we needed to do was work with the employees, and give them a deep kind of mental model of not just the AI model itself, but also the system of which it is part, and also their role within that system. And kind of by doing that, we help to build up their understanding. And that in turn allowed to the calibration of their trust. And this idea of trust calibration is absolutely crucial to, I think, to the work that Renee and I am doing, but also in terms of when we start to look at GenAI, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And so just for clarity, what we mean by trust calibration is an alignment of a user's trust in a system with that latter's capabilities. And so it's a fancy way of saying, when you work with AI, do you understand its strengths? Do you understand its weaknesses and its error bones? And so therefore, when you can trust it, and when maybe you need to have a second look. And so I think this is really important in AI, because we spend so much of our time talking about trustworthy AI and the need for more trust to support adoption. But as we move into Gen AI, which I'll talk about in a minute, I think we need to start shifting more towards trust calibration. And fast forward another couple of years, and through the IDE, I had the good fortune to be introduced to the award-winning Renée Gosline. Just a quick note on IDE, it's an amazing facility for people like me. It gives us the opportunity to really dig into cutting edge ideas, work with world recognized leaders in these spaces, and actually develop solutions, have the time and space to develop solutions that will become tomorrow's, the clients will adopt tomorrow. And I've had an absolutely amazing time working with Renee, Haiwen, Jury, David, and the team at IDE. It's been just a fantastic experience. And as Renee said, we spoke, at least once a week, and she was always there to help me and guide me through troubled waters. So a huge thank you. But I think Renee, we kind of straight away we recognize kind of kindred spirits in terms of you are part of. Your whole group is called Human First, right? And at Accenture, we are very much, a key focus for us is around, a human first approach, is human by design. It was one of our key trends in our trend report this year. And, as well as, I could recognize Renee immediately, right? Her deep expertise in behavioral science, that body of work that she's done in beneficial friction, and also, as you would expect for any MIT professor, a really robust approach to experimentation. I could really see how she was going to elevate the work that we were already doing in Accenture research around trust calibration. But also, we instantly bonded on this idea of a human first approach. And, I think there's a lot of talk today about, is AI good? Is it bad? What is the societal impact? And I actually think it's a really simple question to answer, right? It's, what is your intent? And what I mean by that is, why are you doing what you're doing? And are you doing it for the betterment of, people, society, and the planet? And I think with Renee, we have a common bond there. And then as you rightly pointed out, Renee, I think the other thing that really brought us together is we don't want this research sitting on a shelf somewhere, right? We want this to be very practical. And a lot of the work we did wasn't on the theoretical side or even implementing the experiment. It was on setting everything up so that we did the dirty work, that we got our hands dirty so that companies won't have to in the future. And so as we were kind of going through this and we started to collaborate on this topic, and we could see how Renee's work on beneficial friction represented a really interesting way of addressing this topic of trust calibration. Gen AI happens, right? And we all know Gen AI changes everything, right? But I think it has a huge impact on responsible AI as well. And I think in kind of 3 very specific ways. One is, I think what responsible AI will become is going to change now as a result of Gen AI. So, what is responsible generative AI, and how is it different from traditional responsible AI. I also think it's going to significantly change how we mitigate risks, and that feeds directly into the work that we're doing and why that will become so relevant in Gen AI era. And then finally, I think we're going to understand that there's a shift in why companies are going to adopt responsible AI en masse. And I'll start with the value, right, before I kind of get into the other sides of it. And kind of very quickly, what we're seeing both in our research and our work with clients is that, coming through the door every day, they're not short of ideas, right? They can see the potential of Gen AI, but there's a barrier there, and it's not the usual suspects of data, talent, budget, inability to scale, right? It's the risks. This is what's holding companies back. And I think the companies that can manage these risks are going to be the ones that scale first, that launch products first, and will have a competitive advantage. And similarly, I think longer term, I think the companies that are going to have success in this space aren't necessarily going to be the ones with the best and the greatest technology. It's going to be the ones that build responsible AI into their core and are able to manage the risks for themselves and for their clients. And so as a result, we see responsible AI is now a value lever. And so companies, the companies that can adopt this successfully will go on to be hugely successful in the generative AI space. So that's the why I think this is going to become really important. I think how responsible AI changes, I think in some ways it's stating the obvious, right? We all know that the risk landscape has completely changed. We've gone from talking about algorithmic fairness and explainability to now talking about IP, hallucinations, right? I think we've got to call them confabulations now, according to NIST. Cybersecurity, the environmental impact, and I think, when I look at this space, and unfortunately I don't have to do my own AI trackers anymore. There's plenty of tools online for anyone who's kind of into that kind of thing. But what I've noticed over the last 12 months is kind of two things. One is the number of harms or incidents has risen sharply. And I see this, just in the US, it's up 32% year over year in 2023. And so I think what we're going to see is, we're all familiar with the stories of the unfortunate Samsung engineers, or that lawyer that got thrown out of court, or the employee who's tricked into transferring 20 million. But what worries me is I think these examples are very much going to become the rule rather than the exception over the next 2 to 3 years. So the scale of these harms is going to be very significant. Also, the second big change I see is that, AI is changing, or generative AI is changing by the month these days. Very quickly, it'll be by the day and even the hour. And as we move into new areas like agentic AI and so on, that risk landscape is going to keep changing and evolving. And so at Accenture, our job is to help our clients manage these risks and go to market and unlock that value of Gen AI. And, what we see today is a lot of our clients are at that stage of going from principles or posture to practice, which is operationalizing their RAI framework across their business. And the good news is I think we see that happening en masse. It's a multi-year journey. It requires organizational and operational maturity. But I think we see that that shift is now happening. But we can also see that because of the way that Gen AI, the new risks that it brings, is that we can see a new stage that's going to have to emerge, which is we're all going to have to become pioneers. And what that means is we're going to have to become much more anticipatory in how we manage these risks. So we're going to have to be able to flex and change with these risks as they evolve. And a very simple example of that, I would say, is if you look at how cybersecurity has become a core part of responsible AI now, and it's part of our offering in Accenture, the idea of red teaming, which is very anticipatory in nature, has come to the forefront of responsible generative AI over the last 12 months, even though it's been around in other areas for a long time. So the reason why I'm telling you all this, there is a point to all this, is because of the value that RAI can unlock in Gen AI, but also the risk space that it creates, means that I think the solution to a lot of these problems is not going to be technical in nature; it's going to be human in nature. And yeah, one of the big insights that struck me when, and I know Renee shares this, when GenAI emerged was, and this may seem counterintuitive to some people, but actually the employee becomes absolutely crucial again. And the reason is, as I said, responsible AI now becomes a value lever, but with very limited scope to mitigate risks at the model or the data level, companies are now having to mitigate at the application and the interface level. And we see that in the data. That's where companies are primarily implementing RAI today. And so with that, your employee now suddenly becomes the first line of defense. Their job is also to identify and mitigate risks and also optimize performance, right? And so we see it everywhere. We need a human in the loop. It's in the EU AI Act. For high risk applications, you need to have human oversight. But bringing it full circle, right? Those behavioral issues that we talked about are still as prevalent as ever, right? And that's why I think, as we move to an era where risks are changing and evolving all the time, trust calibration is going to be absolutely crucial here. And working with your employees to facilitate that is going to be a game changer. It's really going to enable companies to unlock that value. And so we have to stop thinking about this from, I think the old approach is to take a very technical approach to this problem. And I think we now have to very much embrace a multidisciplinary approach that looks to solve trust calibration and it has behavioral science as a key component of that. And so I kind of want to finish up just talking a little bit about the experiment that we ran and how we kind of applied this multidisciplinary approach. I'm lucky enough to kind of sit at the DOC, which is Accenture's Global Innovation Center in Dublin, and I have the privilege, I suppose, of being surrounded by a multitude of skill sets. So we have data scientists, engineers, but we also have designers of every stripe. We have behavioral scientists. We have systems thinkers, we have RAI experts. And as we started to look at this problem of GenAI, or this opportunity of GenAI, I should say, we saw, we started looking at LLMs and, the potential for errors and hallucinations and bias. And we started to think about, what are the technical solutions that we could develop here? What are the tools that we could develop that would help employees to better identify risks like hallucinations or incorrect statements. But because of that multidisciplinary kind of setup, we were also very cognizant of this need to calibrate trust and this need that a tool on its own is no good if we're not having the behavioral effect that we want to have. And this is why Renée's work was absolutely crucial to this experiment, and it really unlocked the work that we were doing at the DOC. And I should mention also that research is a key part of the DOC, and I'm going to take the gratuitous opportunity to mention Shekhar Tiwari and Dikshita Venkatesh from Accenture Research and Patrick O'Reilly from Human Sciences Studio, who were really the research component of this from the Accenture side and played a huge part. And so looking at the actual experiment, as we mentioned, getting into how do you actually do this? Experiments they're not easy, right? There's a reason why a lot of people don't do this. And part of it is because, in a practical sense, you've got to integrate this into your working day. And that takes a lot of work. And it's not just, the cost of a large cohort of participants. It's really mundane things like finding time, right? How do you, if you have a sample size of 100 people, how are you going to find a time that works for everyone? And if the culture isn't there to support this, it becomes very hard to get approvals. And so, I think in the case of Accenture Research, they are taking a very, very much an AI first approach to the work we do, and they strongly believe in doing that in a responsible way. So, they could really see the value of the experimentation we were doing and also the need to understand and calibrate trust through behavioral experimentation. And that really unlocked a lot for us, and as a result, as Renée will show, not only did we kind of validate the tool that we were testing as part of the experiment, but we also created a lot of value, I think, in terms of finding the right balance in terms of beneficial friction that, it's not just about mitigating the risk, but it's also got to be done in a way that also optimizes performance. And again, it's Renée's work here that was key to unlocking that. And the experiment really helped us to prove that. And that solution is now rolled out with clients. It's fully scaled up. And so, I think to kind of wrap up here, I think the key takeaway from Accenture is that, calibrated trust is going to become absolutely essential as part of any RAI strategy. And, especially for, it's not just about managing risks anymore. It's also about unlocking the real value of GenAI. And so as part of that, our belief is that, a multidisciplinary approach is required here. And, although we're only scratching the surface by our own admission, Renée, in the work that we've done so far, I think, our hope is to continue to do so and really help clients to, adopt GenAI in a responsible and a human-first way. And so with that, I'll hand back over to you, Renée. Thanks, everybody, for listening in. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. I think we've got 10, 15 minutes at the end, or, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you for that background and that perspective. It's always just a joy to partner with people who are actually implementing this. So I want to start by orienting us as to why we thought this was important and why I think about this here at the IDE. There's a lot of conversation and, as Sinan would say, hype machines, right, around AI, and generative AI has definitely put that in overdrive. And you see a lot of conversation about AI first organizations. And when we think about an AI first organization, it sort of raises the question, well, then who's second? And I think the perspective at the IDE is not AI first for AI first sake, but rather thinking about humans first. And so the research that we've been doing is at the nexus of three streams of knowledge: behavioral science and the understanding of cognitive bias and what leads people to optimal or suboptimal decision-making; artificial intelligence, which here is sort of a catch-all term that would include things like LLMs and GenAI, but just the idea that people can outsource some of their cognitive load to these programs, these predictive programs, and the circumstances under which that overlap leads to better decision-making, and the circumstances under which actually it leads to suboptimal. And then finally, like, what does this mean for differentiation within the market? What does this mean for preference around products and services? And of course, a competitive strategy. So the humans are at the center of this, and that's really important. Now, to orient us from a behavioral science lens, we're all familiar with system 1, system 2, thinking fast and slow, and kind of intuitive versus more analytical thinking. And that's led to popularity with behavioral economics and changes in a variety of systems, policy included. So you see Kat Sunstein's latest book, the cover here, Sludge. And it's this idea of that sludge really is a pain point, whether we're talking about taxes, whether we're talking about healthcare. And the goal is to remove as much sludge as possible, right? That this friction that is called sludge is something that is meant to be eradicated to lead to optimal choice. And so firms have jumped all in on this perspective. So you can see here marketing and CX executive strategies. Top of it is frictionless integration of emerging technologies over the next few years. Here we have reduced customer effort and friction through automation, optimization, elimination. It sort of raises the question, who gets eliminated, right? And so this notion of like removing friction and having more and more frictionless applications has become quite popular in customer experiences, whether we're talking about B2C customers or B2B customers. But, when we think about AI and the adoption of AI, which is certainly, the slope has been incredible, there is cause for concern. So this survey has 65% of executives can't explain how their AI models make decisions. And I think probably 35% of those respondents were being really optimistic. Then we see some recent research out of Sloan, where 78% of organizations use third-party tools, but 55% of all failures, are due to those third-party tools. So this idea of, automate, eliminate, and remove all kinds of friction with AI as the tool for doing this could lead to actual suboptimal outcomes. And so really the thinking that I've been sort of sitting with for the last couple of years is that when AI is involved, actually sometimes we need beneficial friction, and that it's too simple a notion to equate friction to pain point. And so I wrote about this first in 2022, and it's in HBR if you want to have a look at that. But the idea is to deconstruct all of the touch points at which people are making decisions when they're in these systems, and to take a systemic view to identify places where you could intentionally add friction or remove friction. And that would be something that would help make decisions better, as opposed to hoping or relying on an individual who would outthink an algorithm, for instance, or be more responsible in their values. So one way I tend to think about this and depict this notion is really leveraging the way physics talks about friction. In physics, friction is neither good nor bad. It's a force, and it is a force that you can use. And when you think about a runner, you see friction force there on the ground and static friction force. Now, friction is critical for this runner. If there's too much friction, obviously, it causes, like a blister on the foot, and that's not desirable. But without friction, this runner cannot accelerate, right? This runner slides all over the place. And without friction, this runner cannot change direction. And the ability to accelerate and to change direction, particularly when we have suboptimal decision settings, is critical. So the goal is to eliminate bad friction and to identify places where there are beneficial friction. And this allows us to create systems that would, as Patty mentioned, be both human first and also calibrate the trust. So human in the loop is really talked about quite a bit. Patty mentioned it as well, and you can see it all over the place, everyone talking about this. Here's a recent Forbes cover with Alexander Wang. We're always going to want a human in the loop. But it raises the question, well, what kind of human in the loop system? Where are the humans going? How will the humans work in the loop? And I think that's a very big question. And we just wanted to pull one thread on one manifestation of how humans could be in the loop to improve human-machine interactions. So this started actually with another project that I worked on with Jerry Zhang here at the IDE. And in this project, this was the initial kind of conversation we had with Accenture, where we did an experiment where we tried to understand how GenAI content affects the market's perception of persuasiveness and quality. And by the market, I mean the audience. So we had 4 experimental conditions, and we wanted to understand how people would deem the quality of this output when GenAI is involved or not, and how that might vary whether they know GenAI is involved or not. So there are 4 experimental conditions. The first one, we have human professionals who work on generating content based on a prompt. And these fantastic professionals were actually, we gained access to them because of Accenture. The second condition was AI receiving a prompt, the same prompt, and creating content around a product or service, I should mention. The third is starting with a frictionless content creation. So the GenAI creates the content, and then the human edits at the end. And then the fourth condition is the inverse, right? So friction at the beginning when it comes to content generation, same prompt again, and then the GenAI edits what the human created. And what we wanted to understand is, how does this affect people's willingness to purchase a product or service when this content is created? So a behavioral measure of how persuasive it is and how people deemed the quality. And it turns out it does make a difference. It makes a difference in that when people are not informed about the authorship, they believe that GenAI's content or the content that was ultimately edited by GenAI is quite high in quality, or higher even in quality and persuasiveness when they're uninformed. However, when they become informed, this changes, and the human generated or human involvement input then rises, and that gap goes away. And so this research we published a few months ago in a paper which was published in Judgment and Decision Making called Human Favoritism, Not AI Aversion. And this really started us thinking about how the role that humans play in the loop requires a more nuanced explanation, that this idea of frictionless and automation and elimination of humans should absolutely not be the goal, and that the role of humans is, as Patty mentioned, more important. And you could imagine, as GenAI is quoting GenAI, knowing that a human has been involved in the creation of this content could serve as a signal of not just quality, but safety, authenticity, and the like. So this was kind of the start of this. And then we started to think about friction as it related to things like ChatGPT. And I should say that OpenAI has added some friction to ChatGPT. So you can see there's a little pop-up here that says, don't share sensitive information, check your facts. There may be some inaccuracies. So I love that. That's good. And so the empirical question is, how does adding some friction affect, as Patty mentioned, from an internal to the organization perspective, so not a market perspective, but a producer perspective, how does this affect the accuracy of the content and the kind of quality that sort of comes out? And how does this affect the work situation in terms of efficiency? So if you get this content, and this is obviously just a placeholder content from ChatGPT, could adding some friction help improve quality? And indeed, we tested this with Accenture as our partner, with actual Accenture employees in a variety of offices globally who agreed to participate in the experiment. And this task we gave them, which I'll describe in a second, is in line with tasks that they do typically, which is these are researchers who write reports about companies and industries, of course, for their clients. And the question is, could they incorporate generative AI to make this more efficient without sacrificing accuracy? And is there a way to do this to sidestep that danger of third-party tools that I sort of spoke about before, which is not just relying on ChatGPT as it is, but could you develop a tool that could be used by organizations to say, hey, we might use generative AI, but we would do so in a way that makes the most sense for us? So we tested adding some friction or cognitive speed bumps, if you will, and our dependent variables that we cared about was whether or not, first of all, this increased accuracy. And this was measured by the numbers of errors that were missed. So we intentionally planted errors, and we wanted to measure as a behavioral measure a difference in accuracy in terms of how many errors missed. And the other behavioral measure, behavioral meaning not self-report, right? Objective measure is how much time it took for them to actually do the task. And so what the difference was there. We measured these objective behavioral measures, but we also measured self-report. So we wanted to also find out, like, what was their experience like, and how did they feel about their performance with this? So just to give you a sense of the experimental design, they were given both the prompt and the content that was created by generative AI. And so you can see one experimental condition had full friction, and that was lots of different highlights to say, pay attention to what's going on here, and adding these cognitive speed bumps. So the green is calling your attention to something that, according to the tool, suggests that this looks good, right? And this appears to be a match to available information. Then there are highlights about, hey, you might want to have a second look at this. This looks like it could be wrong. But also the blue at the bottom, based on the prompt, it looks like there was some stuff that may have been omitted that you might want to have a look at as well. So this was the full friction condition. The second condition was partial friction or medium friction, as we called it. And this one had only the, hey, you might want to have a second look at this. This could be wrong stuff, right? So no attaboy, attagirl stuff. And we thought maybe that could be helpful because it could improve trust or reliance for people to say, okay, this is looking good. But in the second experimental condition, we had none of that. And it was just simply like, hey, you might want to have a second look at this. And the third experimental condition was the control, right? Which is what you have today when you use ChatGPT, you get the content and none of the highlighting and none of the labels. So what did we find? The results are coming out in slow management review. And you can see here our co-authors are listed, Jerry, Haiwen, Arnab, Philippe, and Patty. And we talk about nudging friction here. We very much wanted this to be something actionable and applicable. So we're really pleased that we could create a version of this for SMR. So what we found is if you look at this tension between mitigating inaccuracy, but also being efficient with regard to time, we find that there is a difference. So let me show you what we see here. We see the three conditions: full friction, medium friction, and low friction. Now, when you look at the orange bars, so these are errors missed, this is our measure of accuracy, you can see that in the full highlight and error highlight conditions, there's no significant difference between these bars, which means that full highlighting significantly reduces errors versus the control, but so did our medium friction condition. So these are virtually equivalent when it comes to accuracy. However, when you look at the red bar, which is the amount of time spent, you see that the medium friction condition and the low friction, which is the control condition, these two are actually not significantly different. So what we find is the medium friction condition buys you greater accuracy, a la the full friction condition, which would slow you down a lot. But you don't have to slow people down so much because, in fact, you can actually both reduce the errors and preserve the amount of time or the efficiency when it comes to the actual task. Now, we measured these two behavioral variables, but we also measured some subjective variables. And I want to share a couple with you that we found particularly interesting. Now, from a behavioral perspective, we know about cognitive biases. One cognitive bias is the overconfidence bias. So people tend to be overconfident in their ability to identify things that are wrong or error prone. And when it comes to human in the loop, I think this is a really important bias to consider. Turns out that people are overconfident in their ability to correct and manage algorithms. So this is a null result in that there is no significant difference between the three conditions. But the measure is a subjective one, which is they agree or disagree on a Likert scale that they are now more aware of the types of errors to look for when using LLMs. We can see that there is no significant difference between the experimental conditions. But we know from performance measures, there actually is a difference. We know that they actually are more aware of the types of errors to look for when friction is present. So this suggests to me that this is not an individual level difference solution, right? As much as Patty and I both care about responsible AI, we can't rely on individuals like us to right the ship. This needs to be a systemic and a structural solution because people do suffer from overconfidence bias when it comes to humans in the loop. And last, but certainly not least, when we think about where there should be friction, it turns out that once people receive the generative AI content, that train has left the station, and it's really, people suffer or experience what, from a behavioral perspective, is called an anchoring bias, right? So people anchor on the generative AI content and insufficiently adjust away from it, such that we see that their final submission of their written report has a low text diversity as measured here and has a high similarity to the GenAI content to the degree of 60 to 80%. So other research has identified that GenAI can be really helpful for novices when it comes to using GenAI if you don't know a ton, right, about a category. So I don't know a lot about open heart surgery. So if I were writing a paper on this, GenAI could bring me up to a decent level. And this probably is not too bad because without it, likely my quality would be far lower. But if you have people who are experienced or have expertise, this could be cautionary, right? Because you don't necessarily want them over relying on generative AI in this way. So when Patty talks about calibrated trust, thinking about these types of cognitive biases, I think is a way to sort of assess how we can address this and get around this. So Ryan has a comment, and I please feel free to put comments in as we go through. I don't have much more. So yes, this is a concern for you, Ryan, the difference between writing and editing. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we run the risk of relegating humans to the editor role. And as someone who writes papers, the editing is not the most fun, the most fun part. Patty, based on our experience, I think you can now agree, right? The most fun part is the original idea, right? And getting it down. So absolutely, I think this is a really good point. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you, Watan, for your comments. We're really excited about this work. One thing that you might be wondering, and I actually didn't put it in the presentation, but I think it's good to mention is you might be wondering, okay, if we show all this friction and these errors, does it reduce people's experience, right? Do people not want to use this? Are they saying this is a drag or this is error prone and therefore I don't want to use it? In another subjective measure, we asked people about their willingness to use this kind of tool moving forward. And actually, the willingness was quite high. Almost, everyone was like, I'm all in, very high on a 7-point Likert scale. So I think, the takeaway for me is that adding friction is not a pain point. Right? Not all friction is equivalent to a pain point. You can actually deliberately add beneficial friction, and it doesn't serve to make people flee or to reduce their experience as a user. So just one last thing that we are doing kind of going forward in this space. We know that no algorithm performs perfectly. Algorithmic error is just like human error, unavoidable. And so understanding kind of when people experience algorithmic aversion or appreciation, I think is critical. And Jerry and I have a paper that's under review right now where we ran experiments to look at this. So past research has talked about algorithmic aversion, algorithmic appreciation as a cognitive bias, either in the direction of or away from algorithms. And we started to think about, well, what are the factors that lead to this? And couldn't we think about this as less of a binary measure and more of a continuous measure, a sort of curve that would help us identify kind of an inflection point where, maybe there's too much error or enough error, or the error is tolerable. So past research has looked at, when people might exhibit this according to like the function, is it, a kind of creative task? My colleague, co-author Heather and I have looked at this with regard to if you're a system 1 or system 2 dominant cognitive style. And then other research has looked at this with regard to error. And this research has shown that basically when people see algorithmic error, they get thrust into algorithmic aversion. They have a very low tolerance for this, and they all of a sudden are like, hey, I don't want to hear from this. I prefer the human. But Jerry and I have run an experiment to look at this, and we've looked at pre, during, and post. So try to understand how this changes and is it malleable? And this paper is available right now. It's under review, but a draft of it is available at SSRM. And essentially what we find is there is a curve where algorithmic error or appreciation, kind of turns, and that this preference is dynamic. It's not reliant upon your cognitive bias going in. But what we thought was really interesting is that the cognitive mechanism that explains this is whether or not people think the human would have done worse. So people have a greater tolerance for algorithmic error if they have the cognitive bias that, sure, the algorithm made an error, but humans would have probably done worse on this task. So I'll take it. So what does all this mean for this human in the loop? The three takeaways here are, first of all, automating out humans is a big mistake, and I'm so glad that Accenture agrees. There is value in knowing that a human is involved in the content and is collaborating with generative AI. The second is that cognitive speed bumps can mollify this perceived tension between time and accuracy, and that you can improve accuracy without sacrificing time. And this is but one manifestation of beneficial friction. There are many others that could be explored. So please feel free to reach out if you want to look into this with me or with us. And then the last is that, AI doesn't have to be perfect for people to deem it useful. So you can add beneficial friction. You can show those highlights and labels, and people will still figure out a way to get benefit and use out of it. And that's really good because there's a tremendous amount of investment in AI, right? And so people are keen to get a return on their investment. And it turns out you can have this issue of beneficial friction without running people off. So there's so much more to explore. We have scratched the surface, as Patty mentioned, but that's it for us. Thank you so much. You can reach out to me at MIT. I'll put my email in the chat. And thanks everybody for your comments. And Patty, you're not my partner in crime. You're my partner in fighting crime, I feel like. So it's always a pleasure. So Ryan, you have something in the chat. Sinan, should I throw it over to you?
No, happy for you to take that question. We are approaching time, so maybe a quick.
Sweet. So Ryan, yeah. So I think that's right. I think this is a systemic solution. I was trained as a sociologist, so even though I talk about behavioral science and cognitive bias, I feel like both are really important. And as you can see with the overconfidence bias, we can't just rely on individual level capacities and talent to correct this. So I think that baking in friction systemically is important. And I think that experimentation is one of the best examples of beneficial friction. If we just simply surveyed people, we would have probably ended up with a very different conclusion, I think, right, Patty?
Absolutely, yeah.
So testing this in a field experiment is beneficial friction. Is it easy? Is it seamless? Is it frictionless? Absolutely not. But I think it gives us some predictive power and pressure tests this. So thank you, Ryan, for your question and for your comment.
I just wanted to quickly note to the two of you that Haiwen Lee and I just completed a big representative randomized experiment, about 5,000 people, on trust of generative search results. So we'd love to kind of have you guys kick the tires on that one, and love to share that with you. So I'll definitely put Haiwen in touch with you guys. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you both. This was extremely informative and super fascinating. The ongoing work in this stream that the two of you are leading is fantastic and really a huge part of what we're doing at the IDE. And Renee, as always, thank you very much for all your leadership. And Patty, it's great to meet you, and I look forward to a lot more collaborations. To everyone else, thank you for coming. Obviously, very informative. Next week, we will have Sendil Mullainathan from University of Chicago and his co-author, Ashish Rambachan from MIT. That will be an in-person and a Zoom session on the 15th, which will close out our last seminar of the semester. So look forward to seeing you at that one. Thanks, everybody.